How we doing, everyone? This is Dr. B, and today we're going to talk about the Indian Child Welfare Act, better known as ICWA. On Wednesday, November 9th, 2022, the Supreme Court held oral arguments in the case Brackeen V Haaland, a decision that could overturn the Indian Child Welfare Act of 1978. The Indian Child Welfare Act is a landmark piece of federal legislation meant to halt the removal of Native children from their families and tribal communities. But what exactly is the Indian Child Welfare Act? And why is ICWA so important to the well-being of Indian children and the protection of tribal sovereignty and nationhood? Also, who are the forces behind the potential removal of ICWA, a law that overwhelmingly tribes support? These are some of the topics I'm going to get into today. To understand ICWA and the widespread removal of Native American children from their families and tribal communities, we have to really interrogate history, and we have to have a basic understanding of white supremacy and settler colonialism. So let's go back in time a bit. Prior to 1492, the entire Western Hemisphere was inhabited by hundreds of free and autonomous indigenous communities. In fact, every square inch of the Western Hemisphere was occupied by tribal nations. After 1492, when Christopher Columbus landed in the Caribbean, a terrible Holocaust ensued. Europeans wanted the land, they wanted the resources, and they wanted to save indigenous souls. So we're talking about some of the worst crimes against humanity: genocide, ethnic cleansing, widespread sexual assault of indigenous women, forced slavery, wars of extermination, and of course, the kidnapping of Native children. Indigenous communities didn't simply give up their lands and resources. They fought hard to defend their homelands and their peoples. And I would even argue that that fight continues here in 2022. When the United States is created, they continue this policy of extermination to completely rid Native Americans from territories that they're looking to acquire. In fact, Native Americans are slowly pushed off their lands and forced onto what is called Indian reservations. Native Americans then become fully dependent on the U.S. government for their survival. In the process of forced removal and ethnic cleansing, the United States also uses treaty agreements as a means of acquiring indigenous territories. In fact, there are 371 treaties that were signed and ratified by Congress, probably another 400 treaties that were never ratified. These treaties are still binding and guarantee several rights and privileges of indigenous communities. These treaties are also the bedrock of what we call tribal sovereignty and tribal nationhood. In other words, Native American tribes have always been treated as nations, not as a racial group. This is in the Constitution. After most of the Indian Wars had ended, the United States instituted a policy of forced assimilation. This resulted in the boarding school system. In the boarding school system, Native Americans were forcibly taken from their families and forced into these federally run schools. They were forced to convert to Christianity. They had their hair cut. They were often punished and beaten for speaking their language. There is widespread sexual and physical abuse. In fact, Native American children are being leased out as laborers to work to pay for these underfunded education programs. The entire purpose of the boarding school system was to completely destroy Native American culture. An Army officer by the name of Henry Pratt famously is quoted as saying, "Kill the Indian and save the man." And that was the policy. They wanted to destroy Native American culture by taking away the children from Native American families and forcing them into these federally run assimilation programs. Parents did not have a choice whether or not they were allowed to send these kids off to these schools. Literally, the federal government came to these Indian reservations and forced parents to give up their children. In some cases, these kids never made it back home. Many of these children died in these schools. Okay, I want you to imagine this for one moment. Your child is age 4, age 5, and somebody comes knocking at your door and takes away your kid and sends your kid off to some place and you don't even know where. You may never see your child again. And if you do see your child again, you don't speak the same language any longer, you don't practice the same religion, you may not even be able to communicate with your child any longer. Imagine that for one moment. This happened to literally thousands of Native American families across the United States. This is an act of genocide. The Geneva Convention on Genocide is pretty clear. Forcibly transferring children of the group to another group is an act of genocide. And this happened again to thousands of Native American children across the country. Needless to say, the history of Native America after the United States is created is just one of trauma. We're talking about imprisonment, death, forced removal, extermination, sexual assault, in some cases even slavery. We're talking about a long list of crimes against humanity. Even though Native American communities have experienced some of the worst human rights abuses, they have fought hard to keep their nationhood and sovereign status alive. Native American nations have their own set of laws, their own constitutions in some cases. They have their own political, social, and economic institutions. There is a complex relationship between tribal nations and the federal government. This is a very important point. Tribes are not racial groups. Tribes are nations. There is a nation-to-nation relationship that most Americans are completely ignorant to. Why was the passage of the Indian Child Welfare Act so important for tribal communities? Well, the Bureau of Indian Affairs was going into tribal communities and taking away Native American children and having them adopted into white families. There was a belief that Native kids would be better off being raised by white folks. There's also social workers that are going into Native American communities and taking away Native American children from their grandparents and extended family members when they weren't being raised by their biological parents. There was also an attitude that Native Americans were poor, their culture was backwards, and so there was a lot of racial discrimination against Native American families, and this led to literally thousands of Native American kids who are being taken away from their families and being adopted by white people. Some families even had a drill. If kids were to see a car drive up to their home that they did not recognize, these kids would run and hide because literally thousands of Native American kids were being taken away from their families. In fact, research that was done in the 1970s indicated that anywhere from 25 to 35% of all Native American kids ended up in some type of foster care situation. Of that 25 to 35%, 85% of those kids were being adopted into non-Native families. The Indian Child Welfare Act was passed to give tribal communities the right to determine what happens to their tribal members, to determine what happens to their children. The law works to keep Native American kids with their family, or at least with extended families or somebody within the tribal community. ICWA is not a perfect law. Every single day, Native American kids are adopted into non-Native families. In fact, some Native American families have an uphill climb in trying to keep their kin within their communities. I mean, we're talking about some really horrific and traumatic situations that happen all across Indian country today. So this is what tribes are up against. You have white families who are attempting to use the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment to completely dismantle ICWA. Basically, you have white people who are saying that ICWA is reverse discrimination. Talk about white privilege. Tribes are up against a three-headed monster. You have evangelical families who view Native American children as needing to be saved. You have very powerful law firms like Gibson Dunn who represent gas and oil companies who would like nothing more than to see the complete dismantling of tribal sovereignty altogether. And you have these adoption lawyers who literally make millions of dollars off of taking Native American children from their families and adopting them into non-Native families. These adoption lawyers and firms absolutely hate ICWA. Okay, here's the deal. Tribes are sovereign nations. They are not a racial group. Overturning ICWA could set a very dangerous precedent that could lead to the complete dismantling of tribal sovereignty and tribal nationhood. ICWA supports the inherent rights of tribes to act as sovereign nations, to be the ones who determine what happens to their communities, but also to have the right to raise their children in a way that is reflective of their indigenous ways of life. The forces at work here who want to completely dismantle ICWA are really following in the footsteps of their settler colonial ancestors who have from the beginning have wanted to completely annihilate the existence of indigenous communities here in the Western Hemisphere. The Supreme Court just heard oral arguments on the case of Brackeen V Haaland, which challenges the constitutionality of ICWA. Now, this case has yet to be determined by the Supreme Court, but it could lead to the undoing of ICWA and also lead to future laws that are passed that would completely dismantle this nation-to-nation relationship that the federal government has always had with tribal communities. What can you do to help? You can start by signing the petition to protect ICWA. I'll make sure to put a link to that in the show notes. It's also important that every American spends a little time learning about the federal trustee responsibility. There is a complex relationship between the federal government and federally recognized tribes. I think it's important that all Americans learn a little bit about that relationship. It's also important for us to interrogate the structure of settler colonialism. Settler colonialism isn't about past events. It's not about history. Settler colonialism is a structure that was put into place to completely disenfranchise Native Americans. It's important for us to understand that system if we really want to understand the plight of indigenous communities across this country. Continue to educate yourself, friends, and family members. We can't undo the trauma of the past, but what we can do is support tribal communities by supporting tribal sovereignty. If you got something from this video, feel free to share it. This is Dr. B. Until next time.